night of my brother's wedding, my parents stood in front of 200 guests and handed him the deed to our grandfather's property, 40 acres in Vermont that our family had owned for 60 years. They handed me an envelope too. Inside was a card that said, "Congratulations to the happy couple," and $500 in cash. My brother didn't even look at me when they did it. My sister-in-law smiled like she'd been expecting it. I was 31 years old. I had spent the last 4 years building a patent portfolio that my father's company had been quietly using without my knowledge, without my permission, and without paying me a single dollar. I didn't know that yet. I found out 11 weeks later, when 43 messages arrived on my phone in the span of 6 hours. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. My name doesn't matter as much as the story, but for the sake of telling it, I'm a materials engineer. I've been working in chemical research since I was 24, first in a lab at the University of Michigan, then independently after my father offered to fund my startup research on the condition that I stay close to home and eventually bring my work back into the family business. I was naive enough to say yes. That condition, and my naivety about what it really meant, is where everything starts. My father built his company on industrial coatings, paints and sealants for commercial construction. Boring, stable, profitable. He started it in his 30s, grew it through my entire childhood, and made no secret of the fact that he expected my brother to take it over someday. My brother is 4 years older than me, went to business school, married well, and never once expressed any interest in coatings of any kind. None of that mattered. He was the son. I was the daughter who went the science route, which in my family was spoken about with a kind of polite bafflement, like I'd announced I was joining the circus. When I was 26, I developed a thermal barrier formulation, a coating compound that performs significantly better than existing products in high-heat industrial applications. I won't go deep into the chemistry, but the short version is that it reduced heat transfer in certain structural applications by about 30% compared to the industry standard. I filed the provisional patent myself. My father said he was proud of me. My mother said it sounded very complicated. My brother said, "So is it like a better paint?" Yes, it was like a better paint. The following year, I filed the full utility patent. My company was small, just me and 2 research assistants, but the patent was in my name, my company's name, and registered with the USPTO without any involvement from my father's business. I had made sure of that specifically, because even then, something told me to be careful. Not that I suspected anything, I just wanted it to be mine. I had spent my whole life watching my father talk about the company like it was a living thing that needed to be protected and fed and passed down, and I wanted one thing that was just mine. My father's company started using my formulation about 8 months later. He told me it was a test run. He said he'd talked to his lawyers and they were working something out. He said family doesn't need contracts the way strangers do. I believed him because he was my father, and because I wanted to believe him, and because I was 30 years old and still, despite everything, trying to be the daughter who didn't make things difficult. 18 months passed. The test run became standard production. My formulation was in their commercial product line. My father's company won 2 regional industry awards, partly citing the performance improvements in their new sealant, improvements that came directly from my compound. I found that out from a trade magazine, not from my father. When I brought it up, my father said we'd talk about it after the wedding. There was always something happening before we could talk about it. First it was the holidays, then my brother's engagement, then wedding planning. Then, let's not stress your mother out right now. Then the wedding itself. The wedding was in September, on a Saturday, at a vineyard in the Hudson Valley that my sister-in-law's parents had rented for the weekend. It was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are. Everything arranged to be looked at, nothing designed to be actually comfortable. I sat at a table near the back with my aunt and 2 cousins I barely knew. My parents sat at the head table. My brother and sister-in-law sat at the center of everything, which was correct because it was their wedding, and I want to be clear that I hold nothing against them for that. What happened at the end of the night is what I hold something against. My father tapped his glass during the toasts. He'd already given one earlier, the standard sentimental father of the groom speech. But this time he had something else to say. He said he wanted to mark the occasion with something meaningful. He talked about legacy, about continuity, about what it means to build something and pass it to the next generation. He talked about my grandfather clearing that land in Vermont in 1961 with a second-hand chainsaw and a lot of stubbornness. He cried a little. He's good at crying at the right moments. Then he said he wanted to give my brother and sister-in-law the Vermont property as a wedding gift. The deed was already transferred, he said. The house on the land had been renovated. He'd been working on it for the past year, quietly as a surprise. He wanted them to have a place to build their life. The room erupted. My sister-in-law cried. My brother hugged my father for a long time. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a linen napkin. 200 people applauded. I sat at the back table and thought about the summer I was 8 years old, when my grandfather took me up to Vermont and taught me to identify maple trees by their bark. I thought about how he used to call me his little scientist, before I knew what the word meant. I thought about how he died when I was 16 and left that property to my father with the understanding, at least as my father always told it, that it would stay in the family. I had never been told, at any point, that the family meant something that didn't include me. An hour later, my mother found me near the coat check. She pressed an envelope into my hand and said, "We didn't forget about you, sweetheart." Inside was $500 and a card. "For your research," she said. "We know you're always working on something." I thanked her. I drove 3 hours home alone. I called no one that night because I didn't know what I would say. My father's company was using my patent and had been for nearly 2 years. I knew I needed to figure out what that meant legally. I'd been putting it off because confronting my father felt harder than the alternative, which was continuing to pretend things were fine. But the envelope in my bag changed something. Not the money. $500 is not an insult, taken in isolation. It was the combination, the deed and the card. The 40 acres and the $500, the message embedded in the contrast. I called a patent attorney on Monday. Her name was Irene, and she had been recommended to me by a colleague in my department at Michigan. I explained the situation. She asked several precise questions. She went quiet for a moment after I answered them. The kind of quiet that means someone is doing math in their head. Then she said, "How long did you say they've been using it?" 22 months, I told her. She said she'd need to look at my filing dates, my father's production records if I could get them, and any communication between us about the formulation. She said I should compile everything I had, emails, texts, any notes from phone calls. I went home and opened my inbox and found, over the next 3 days, something I hadn't fully understood until I laid it all out in order. My father had never once put anything in writing about compensation or licensing. But I had sent him 3 separate emails over the past 2 years, asking when we would sort out the details. And in each case, he had responded with warmth and deflection. One said he was so proud of what you're building. One said, "Let's have dinner and talk through everything properly." One said, "Your grandfather would be amazed by what you've done." Not a single concrete answer, not a single number, not a single acknowledgement that using my patent without a license was something that required an agreement. I sent everything to Irene. She came back to me a week later. She said that based on standard industry licensing rates for this category of patent, and the volume of product my father's company had produced in that period, the unpaid licensing fees were somewhere between $3.5 and $4.5 million. I read that number 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk that lasted about an hour and a half and covered very little actual ground. I need to be honest about what I felt, because I think it matters for understanding what came next. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sick. The specific, hollow sickness of realizing that someone you love has been taken from you quietly and consistently in a way that was designed to be hard to see until it was too late to undo. I kept thinking about the tests run. I kept thinking about family doesn't need contracts the way strangers do. I kept thinking about dinner plans that never happened and conversations that always got postponed until after something else. I also kept thinking about the Vermont property, about 40 acres and a chainsaw and a little girl learning to read maple bark. I told Irene I wasn't ready to file anything yet. I needed more information first. She said she understood, but that I should know my options had a timeline. The longer things went on, the more complicated certain remedies became. I said I understood. Then I drove to see my grandmother. My grandmother is 79 years old and lives in a condo in western Massachusetts that she moved to after my grandfather died. She has opinions about most things and does not moderate them for social convenience. She was the one who taught me to play chess when I was 7, and her standard of teaching was to play her actual best game against me until I could hold my own, which she said was the only honest way to learn anything. I told her what was happening. All of it. The patent, the 2 years of production, Irene's estimate, the wedding envelope. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you think your father would give you that land?" I said I didn't know. I said I hadn't thought about it concretely until the moment he didn't. She said, "He's been planning to give it to your brother since before the engagement. He told me 2 years ago. I told him it wasn't right. He said you were doing your own thing and didn't need it." She paused. "I should have told you. I'm sorry. I didn't say anything for a while." Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. The afternoon light came through her blinds in long stripes across the floor. "Your grandfather would have made sure this didn't happen," she said finally. "Not the land, the patent. He understood that kind of thing. He always said you were the one who understood value." She got up and went to her bedroom. She came back with a folder. The old kind, manila with a metal clasp. The kind nobody uses anymore. Inside were several documents. One was a letter, handwritten, dated 4 years ago, shortly before my grandfather died. It was addressed to her, but the last 2 paragraphs were clearly meant for me because my name was in them. He wrote that he hoped she would give it to me when the time was right. He wrote that he had always believed I would build something important, and that when I did, I should make sure it belonged to me and no one else. He wrote that the people who love us don't always protect what's ours, and that I should learn to protect it myself. He wrote that he was proud of me. I held that letter for a long time. Then I asked my grandmother if I could keep it. She said she'd been waiting to give it to me for 4 years. I called Irene on the way home and told her I was ready to move forward. The demand letter went out 6 weeks later. Formal notice of patent infringement, documentation of the 22 months of unauthorized commercial use, a licensing fee calculation based on industry standards, and a deadline for response. The letter went to my father's company, addressed to him as CEO, with a copy to his business attorney. It was the first time my father learned that I had retained legal representation. He called me within 4 hours. His voice was the voice I remembered from childhood when something had gone wrong. Not angry exactly, but tight, controlled, the voice of a man who was managing himself very carefully. He said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." I said, "Tell me what you think was misunderstood." He said the arrangement between us had always been informal and that he had intended to compensate me, he just hadn't gotten to it yet, and that sending a lawyer's letter was not the way the family handled things. He said my mother was upset. He said my brother was shocked. He said he hoped I understood how this looked. I said, "I'd like to understand how it looks from my side. I developed the compound. I held the patent, and your company used it commercially for 22 months without a licensing agreement. I asked 3 times in writing when we were going to formalize things. You didn't answer those questions. Can you explain what I misunderstood?" He was quiet. It was a different kind of quiet than Irene's. Not calculating, but something between wounded and cornered. He said, "You're my daughter." I said, "I know. That's why I gave you 2 years. We didn't speak again that day. My sister-in-law called me 2 days later. She was calm and careful in the way that people are when they've prepared what they want to say. She said she knew this was complicated and that she hoped we could find a way through it that didn't damage the family permanently. She said she thought maybe we could all sit down together and talk before things escalated further. She said, I know it probably felt bad, the wedding gift thing. I told him it wasn't right. I was grateful that she said that. I also noticed that she called it the wedding gift thing, which is the verbal equivalent of making something smaller by calling it something smaller. I told her I was open to a conversation, but that the conversation needed to involve lawyers present on both sides, documentation on the table, and concrete numbers. I told her that I had spent 2 years having informal family conversations about this, and that I thought we'd all exhausted that format. She said she understood. I think she actually did. My brother called the next morning. He sounded like himself, slightly scattered, rushing to get somewhere, not quite fully present for the conversation. He said he just found out that Dad had been using my formulation without a license, and that he thought that was, and this is a direct quote, kind of messed up, honestly. He said he hadn't known. He said he thought my father had sorted it out with me properly. I believed him. My brother is many things, but he's not a planner. He doesn't scheme. He just occupies whatever space is available to him without examining too carefully how it got there. I told him I appreciated him saying so. I told him that the legal process was going to move forward regardless, because at this point it had to. He said he understood, and that he hoped I knew he wasn't against me. I said I hoped he could say the same thing to our father. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, I'll try." The negotiation took 11 weeks. My father's first offer was $60,000 as a good faith payment in exchange for a licensing agreement going forward at a reduced rate. Irene's response was polite and specific and made clear that we weren't interested in a reduced rate or a reframing of the situation that described 2 years of infringement as something we were now beginning fresh. His second offer was closer, but structured to be paid out over 5 years with contingencies. Irene said no. His third offer came with a phone call from his attorney directly to Irene, asking if there was any flexibility on the licensing rate given that this was a family situation. Irene called me after and said, "He keeps using the word family. I keep not responding to it. Is that correct?" I said yes. She said, "Good." The final settlement was $3.8 million, paid in 2 installments, plus a proper licensing agreement going forward at standard industry rates. It was not everything Irene had calculated as the maximum possible recovery, but it was within the range she'd considered realistic, and it meant I didn't have to go to court, which I hadn't wanted to do. My father wired the first installment on a Tuesday. That night, 43 messages arrived on my phone between 6 and midnight. My mother, my father, my brother, my sister-in-law, 2 aunts, an uncle I rarely speak to, and several family friends I didn't realize my parents had confided in. I sat on my couch in the dark and read through all of them before I responded to any. My mother's first message said she was heartbroken. Her second said she hoped I was happy. Her third, sent late, said she loved me, and she was sorry things had gone this way. My father's message said nothing about sorry. It said he hoped I understood that this had done damage that would take time to repair and that he expected I would reflect on my role in that. I responded to my mother first. I said I loved her too. I said I hadn't wanted this to become what it became, but that I had needed to protect something that was mine. I said I hoped she could eventually understand that. I didn't respond to my father that night. My brother sent one message. "I'm not going to pretend I understand all of this, but I hope you're okay." It was more than I expected, and it landed differently than the others. Less like someone managing the situation and more like someone genuinely uncertain what to do with it. I wrote back, "I'm okay. Thank you for asking." I called my grandmother the next morning. She already knew. My mother had called her. She listened to me describe the settlement, and then she said, "Your grandfather would have done exactly what you did. Down to the part about not returning your father's message that night." I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in weeks. "What did he used to say?" I asked. I already knew, but I wanted to hear her say it. "He said you can love someone and still not let them take from you. Those things aren't opposites." I've thought about that a lot in the months since. I am not estranged from my family. It would be easier in some ways to tell you that I walked away entirely, that I drew a clean line and started over somewhere new. But that's not what happened, and I think pretending it did would make for a cleaner story than a true one. What actually happened is messier and more ordinary. My father and I have spoken, and those conversations have been difficult and incomplete. The kind where you can both feel the shape of everything that isn't being said. He has not apologized directly. He has said things that orbit an apology, that he should have moved faster, that he didn't realize how it would feel from my side, that he always intended to make it right. I've noticed that none of those statements contain the word sorry, and I've decided not to point that out yet, because I'm still working out what I want from him, that I actually believe he can give. My mother tries. She sends me recipes and articles she thinks I'd find interesting and calls on Sunday afternoons to talk about things that don't involve money or patents or property. I let those calls happen. I think she means well. I think she's spent 40 years choosing peace over truth in small increments and doesn't know how to do otherwise now, but I also think she knows something shifted and she's trying to adjust to the new coordinates. My brother and I are different with each other in a way that's hard to explain. He started asking me questions about my work. Actual questions. The kind that require listening to the answer. It's possible he always could and just didn't. It's possible that watching me hold ground on something changed his understanding of what I was. I don't know yet. We had dinner 2 months ago, just the two of us, and at the end of it he said, "I'm sorry I didn't pay more attention before." It was clumsy and vague and probably didn't cover everything it should have. It was also the only actual apology I received from anyone in my family. I told him it meant something, because it did. The money is in accounts that Irene helped me set up properly, protected, structured, separate from anything involving my father. I used some of it to expand my lab, to hire 2 additional researchers, to finally stop worrying about whether my work was sustainable on its own terms. It is. I know that now, in a way, I didn't a year ago, because I had to prove it in the harshest possible way, by fighting for it when someone I trusted assumed I wouldn't. I have my grandfather's letter framed on the wall above my desk. The last line of it is the part I come back to most often. The people who love us don't always protect what's ours. Learn to protect it yourself. I used to read that as a warning, something to be sad about, the way a lot of true things are sad. Now I read it more like instructions. Not bitter ones. Just honest. I protect what's mine. I also still call my grandmother every Sunday. I'm still working on something new in the lab that no one else owns any part of yet. My grandfather would have been proud of that, I think. Both parts. The protecting and the building. He always said those things belong together. I'm starting to understand what he meant. There's a version of this story where I stay quiet, where I accept the envelope with the $500 and the congratulations to the happy couple card, and I tell myself it doesn't mean what I know it means. I've thought about that version a lot, because for 2 years, that's exactly what I did. I stayed quiet, I asked politely, I waited. I believed that love was enough of a contract, that family was enough of a guarantee. It wasn't. And the thing I've had to reckon with, slowly, without any clean resolution, is that the outcome wasn't bad luck. It was the direct result of choices. His choices to take without asking, yes, but also mine, to keep giving without requiring anything in return. My grandfather understood something that took me 31 years to start learning, that being a good person and being a protected person are not the same thing. He was both, and he made sure to separate them clearly. He built things, kept records, put things in writing, made arrangements that couldn't be undone by sentiment or family pressure, or whoever happened to be in the room when decisions got made. He wasn't cold. He was precise. There's a difference, and I spent most of my life not understanding it. What I did. Filing the patent, keeping the documentation, eventually calling Irene. Those weren't acts of aggression. They were acts of clarity. The clearest thinking I'd done in years, actually, because for a long time I had confused being agreeable with being good and being overlooked with being humble, and those are different things too. Real integrity, I've come to believe, includes the integrity of your own work. You can't actually be honest with other people if you're constantly letting them misrepresent what you've built. The 43 messages that came in those 6 hours, I've read through them more times than I probably should. What I notice now, that I didn't notice at first, is that none of them ask how I'm doing. They're all about what's happening, what this means, what I've done to the family. Not one of them asks if I was okay when my father's company used my formulation for 22 months without a license. Not one of them asks what those 3 unanswered emails felt like to write. The concern arrived with the consequences, not before. I don't say that to be bitter. I say it because it clarified something for me about what I want going forward, in my work, in my relationships, in how I move through the world. I want to be the kind of person who notices before the consequences arrive, who pays attention not because they have to, but because it's right. My brother is getting there. The dinner we had, the apology he offered, clumsy as it was, showed me that he's capable of looking at something squarely and naming it. That matters. I kept my grandfather's letter. I reread it sometimes when I'm tired or uncertain. He wrote it knowing he wouldn't be there to help me, knowing the specific difficulty I would face, knowing that love and fairness don't automatically travel together in families. He prepared me the only way he could, by telling me the truth in advance. That's what I'm trying to do with myself now. Tell the truth in advance. Build things carefully. Keep records not out of suspicion, but out of respect for what I've made. Push through the moments when it would be easier to go quiet, because going quiet is not the same as keeping peace. It's just a slower way of losing ground. I protect what's mine. I'm still learning how to do that without hardening around it. My grandfather managed both. I think that's the real thing he left me.